Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. Today's session is part of a continuing series, Banks as Partners. It's about security, treasury, banking, payment security. I'm here with John Doskocil from TD Bank and Chris Gerda from Bottomline. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Craig. Thrilled to be here.
And Chris, I know we've spoken before. Looking forward to the discussion again.
Yeah, good to be here, Craig. Nice to see you.
Yeah, and before we get started, I think it'd be great to just begin with a quick overview of what you do at your respective companies. And I'll go John and then Chris, if you just tell everyone a little bit about your role at TD Bank or Bottomline.
Sure. So thank you, Craig. I work for TD Bank within commercial distribution, which means that I partner with our clients to discuss issues like fraud and make sure that they are well educated on the industry trends and options to help protect their business. I actually came into banking through cybersecurity. I began my career in the Department of Defense, where I built and defended expeditionary technology networks. So I think that gives me a little bit of a more holistic perspective on what's happening in the industry when it comes to bank fraud and cybersecurity.
Excellent. We'll look for some of those things to be brought to bear. I've heard you speak a number of times, so you know of what you speak about. Chris, give us a quick intro from your perspective.
Sure. So my role at Bottomline Paymodex is leading the risk and fraud prevention efforts across our business-to-business payment network, which means staying ahead of the fraud, using technology to proactively authenticate vendors prior to payment, and controlling our entire payments ecosystem to prevent, most particularly, business email account compromise fraud and fraudulent vendors from becoming a problem for our clients.
Let's get started. We're going to talk about standards, the reasons for the shift in standards, this idea of increasing standards. You know, what was acceptable in the past may no longer be acceptable. We need a heightened level of awareness, level of defense, and then we'll touch base on responsibilities, support, and the response. I'll begin with you, John, and Chris, feel free to jump in on this first section about standards, but I'll start with you, John. As we think about duties of companies to protect and to be a steward of their corporate assets, liquidity, data, et cetera, what do you tell your clients about your duties and the shifting standards? What is the guidance that you find yourself and your team giving them?
As a treasury management professional at a bank, we most closely align with finance teams and financial practitioners within companies, right? These groups of people have been prime targets for cyber criminals, which really isn't a surprise given their role to move money and ensure that it gets to where it needs to go safely, and also the access that they have to financial accounts and financial data. And a recent study that I just read, it was something like 68% of companies had reported being targeted by criminals, and 58% of accounts payables teams had been targeted by something, business email compromise alone. So when it comes to what we tell our clients, the very first message is that we want to make it very clear to them that they are under attack persistently. The data that we've seen throughout the industry makes it very clear that it's not just a question of if, but rather of when you or someone on your team will be attacked by a criminal. And we also add that entering into any sort of cash management agreement for services at any bank binds them in taking commercially reasonable security procedures to prevent these attacks from happening. This is important, I think, because it highlights that we all have kind of a unique role to play in protecting ourselves and each other when it comes to bank fraud and cyber attacks. And then we usually end with making sure that we add that companies are not alone. There's a full ecosystem of partners and stakeholders that they can work with that includes banks to provide resources, get education and services to mitigate some of the fraud strategy and to help them keep that commercially reasonable procedures standard.
Yeah, John, there's some different terms. We sometimes use the term standards of good corporate conduct across the board. Others use the legal definitions of commercially reasonable. And there's some elements about that say, this is the minimum standard you should have. It's unreasonable not to do these types of things, put these defenses in place. Like it's unreasonable not to have a door on your house or not to have a door that locks or a security system. So there's certain things that are, why would you be sending payment files that are unencrypted? Different elements. So maybe we could talk just a minute about what is commercially reasonable security with regard to cybersecurity and how has this changed over time? I think we realize that the criminals are far more sophisticated. They're growing, they're persistent, they're automated, and this requires an adequate defense. And that defense has to be stronger today than it was 2 years ago, and a year and a half from now, it needs to be stronger than it is today. But maybe you could talk about what's been changing over time in terms of a mindset that we should have and perhaps actions.
So I think when we look at cybersecurity and what's commercially reasonable from a cybersecurity perspective, I think that's when things start to blend into a more holistic strategy. There are really 3 layers of security that we're talking about here. We're talking about like a structural layer of security. We're talking about a network layer of security and a human layer of security. So to touch quickly on the structural layer, there are definitely a lot of very good services that banks provide, and they're very effective to create a structural layer of security. And I think that there's a strategy around making sure that the right services are on the right accounts for the function in which clients are using, companies are using those accounts. But then there's also what I'll call the network layer. And within the network layer, that's where companies are expected to ensure the safe storage of their data and the data of their customers and vendors. So the network layer includes things like firewalls, active and passive detection systems, and other security measures that keep themselves and their customers safe. And I think the expectation here is that what is commercially reasonable is that companies have these systems in place internally and that they're staying up to date. On the human layer side of things, this is probably the most difficult to build and defend, but this is also where there's probably the most vulnerability. And I think, we have other episodes that, I don't want to steal Adrian Turpek's thunder here in the human firewall, but ultimately this is all about getting employees trained, right? And then making sure that this training is conducted regularly. And it's so hard to build. That's part of the reason why I'm so excited about, our work, TD Bank's work with you in Secure Treasury to make sure that there is training that's curated for financial professionals specifically, because a well-trained employee is really one of the best defenses against cyber attacks.
You talked about structural network and the human element. One thing we've heard here is there's the hardware, software, and wetware. I won't say wetware because that annoys someone in the office. That's the human part. But in terms of network and structure, are both of those things, the hardware and software, working together? Or is the network hardware and software and the structure is different elements you put together for your banking structure, how your group is organized? Is there a way you would define that?
That's really where the bank comes into play and helps the customer build that level of security, right? It's about the bank accounts themselves and the payments that are coming in and out of them. I think when we talk about the network layer, we're talking more specifically about the perimeter and about securing the data within it. Now, where they all bleed together, and I would add the human layer into this, is that when the network layer or the human layer fall, or when they fail, it provides a way for a criminal to subvert or avoid the structural layer processes, right? So there may be positive pay, check positive pay, accounts, blocks, filters, and that structure may be fully created and built. But if the criminal is able to create a synthetic identity by exposing weaknesses in the human layer and the network layer, then when that synthetic identity is applied, the structural layer defenses like ACH positive pay, check positive pay, touched on before, don't work, right? They subvert them and they get through them. And I think that's where it all kind of comes together.
Chris, I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in on any of the standards that John had talked about, if you'd like, I mean, there's elements of what shifted. Anything to add on what you've seen is shifting over time?
I think John did a great breakdown. Think about the 3 layers. You have structural, network, and human. How do you figure out what those layers are? You look at the attacker, look at who the fraudster is, look at the strategies that they are employing. Now you can reverse engineer that to create your layers. It's almost like you have to become a victim to figure out what you have to do to not become a victim. That is the power of partnering with the correct banks, fintechs, technology providers, because they have the breadth and scope to bring that knowledge to bear. So you don't actually have to become an independent victim to learn what to do. We've seen it, so we can implement it. When I think about structural, network, human, and how the TD Bank and PayModeX partnership works, really we're helping that structural and human piece by bringing this fraud prevention to the forefront. That aids the human element so that they're not, just wandering around without the aid of technology. That strengthens the structural element because we're sending out payments that are secure, not just processing them. And the network layer is really, you just have to have this, right? You are encrypted with all the standards that you need to be, and really transparent about your encryption and cybersecurity with your customers. It's an interesting thing when we talk to clients today. You shake hands and you say hi and you're like, oh, I have all these things I can do for your business. And they're like, hold on, let's talk about your security and make sure that you're even there first before I even hear what you can do for me. They're leading that conversation to make sure that they're partnering with the right providers. And that's a big change that we're seeing in the industry. Security first.
As we move to the reasons for this shift, the shift of standards, a shift towards more partnership, I'll start with you again, John, and then bring you in, Chris, as well. So why has this changed so much? We talked about a little bit about that. Why has it changed? Maybe we can get into some examples, whether it's with social engineering, ransomware, business email compromise, but with a little more granularity than that, they're more sophisticated criminals.
I think it's not really surprising that what's commercially reasonable is shifting. We can think about it this way. When you consider the amount of awareness that we all now have around fraud, the technology that's available, both in terms of the technology to attack networks, but also to defend networks, and then what I would call the integrated digital economy now that we all operate in. So as Chris was saying about security first, that's all about, how we all now more than ever need each other to be taking cybersecurity seriously, just as much as we need to be doing it ourselves. Like there is an element of responsibility for others that we have just as much as we have an element of responsibility for ourselves when it comes to cybersecurity. So in terms of awareness, I don't think there's a financial practitioner out there alive who isn't worried about falling victim to business email compromise scam, right? We all know how significantly negatively that can impact your business and even a career in some cases. And then in terms of technology, yes, hackers are becoming more sophisticated. There's better technology than ever before, but companies have become more sophisticated in their technology that's available, right? And this is not something that a company is alone in. I don't want to really steal Chris's thunder, but the PayModeX network has been incredibly secure for many years. And that's part of the reason why I'm really proud that TD Bank partners with Bottomline. We can provide the customers access to that technology. And part of that is, I think, Chris, you were alluding to it earlier, it's when you go to make the payment, validating that account. So that's one way where when I was discussing earlier about the failures in the network layer and the human layer to provide access for a criminal to subvert these other structural layers, well, account validation can kind of protect you in a new way. That security first mindset is incredibly important because it's the account validation piece of the PayModeX network that I think is very, very powerful. It adds another layer, or it, I guess, strengthens the structural layer of security in that regard.
I got a good add-on to that. You think about like an old-fashioned bank robber who gets really good at picking one type of lock, and then all the banks just don't change that lock type, and he continues to rob banks. That is email. What PayModeX is doing is we're really taking that out of the picture. all of your communication with a vendor can occur through a secure network where a fraudster can hide in an email and be hacked into your email or impersonate you. You'll never know what their digital identity and their fingerprint is. The reason for the change in the shift in that awareness is everyone's seen a hacked email in their inbox last week or the week before, or they've had a phishing email sent to them probably in the last week personally or at business. It's really important to stay ahead of the changes. Loop it back to commercially reasonable. Commercially reasonable is definitely not doing business via email anymore and doing authentication up front, even past just the bank authentication. We see banks opening accounts for fraudsters because they've actually created that synthetic identity to get that account open. And so it looks like they have that name, but there's other digital pieces of what we do in validation that looks well beyond the account and takes it a step further. So that's a really big piece of it. And business email account compromise fraud continues to be successful because email remains the lock on the vault.
Sorry, yeah, Chris, if I could just jump in there real quick, because you talked about commercially reasonable, like email is not commercially reasonable anymore. And I totally agree with you. But I also kind of have empathy, right, for that accounts payable person who gets the email that a vendor's changing their bank information and then now has to, go authenticate it, right? Like, so if they don't have access to some authentication technology, that could derail their day, in certain aspects. So I think that like there's certain levels of inertia, right? And it's the inertia that causes us to kind of operate in a way that's not commercially reasonable, right? Like you're saying, this inertia to, I don't want to take this much time out of my day and I want to have to derail this. So I'm going to, just take the vendor at their word with this email and go for it. So I think that's really where this adoption of technology, and it can really help, especially like you're saying, the PayModeX network employs this account validation technology. That's the amount of time that people can save or accounts payable managers can save by using that when they get some sort of request to change bank information is invaluable because it saves them from having to, make a mistake in a rush.
That's a great point. I mean, one of the things that PayModeX tries to do is when you think of efficiency, you think of a security going down when you increase efficiency. And actually, security is the new efficiency. People see them walking in tandem. And so we empower corporates to actually process efficiently and securely at the same time. They don't have to sacrifice one for the other. Whereas if you increase security, you create a ton of inertia and they can't get anything done because there's too many roadblocks. So if you bring in digital authentication pieces, then you can actually keep your efficiency high and your security high at the same time outside of that email.
So part of this discussion was on business email compromise. A couple other areas that we could touch on would be social engineering, which is perhaps a broader category that includes business email compromise, as well as ransomware. So Chris, maybe you could talk a little bit about what's changing with ransomware. Ransomware is a situation where someone penetrates a system, encrypts data, and they have the key and they don't let you use it. So they've rendered your computers, your networks like a giant paperweight. How can we think about that? Because you're subject to the ransom to get access to your data.
From a payables perspective, specifically, PayModeX has seen this happen to customers, whereas they run their payables through us. And so we are securely housing their banking information in our network outside of their infrastructure. So when they did have a compromise, they did not lose any banking information from any of their vendors. Any of those pieces of critical information, we held them in trust. The fraudsters are completely separate from our network. We're regulated just like a bank, and our encryption standards they speak for themselves. We're very transparent, again, like I said, about our cybersecurity. And so they didn't have to deal with that fallout of reputational damage because the banking information was held securely elsewhere outside of their infrastructure. I mean, ransomware, as it compares to business email account compromise, is a less monetarily damaging fraud from just a pure financial perspective, by far less, but reputationally and the business damage that piles on after that, that's a whole nother quantification. And trust also really a big piece of that puzzle as well. So how can you maintain consistent trust and protect your relationship with your vendors and the suppliers? When I talk about protecting payments, I actually talk more about protecting relationships, and a payment is just part of that. So we're trying to protect the payment, but also the communication, the invoice, communication back and forth. So the more that we can take the communication and where the fraudster wants to prey on someone out of the equation and into a secure area, the less damaging ransomware is if they have that incident, so that they can, move away from it. Just like BEC fraud, ransomware is a numbers game. So it is perpetuated by mass blasts of emails trying to get a backdoor in, and exasperated by extensive social engineering through multiple different omni-channels. Once they get one hook in, they're trying to dive into, more and more pieces. One of the tidbits of advice I give to any large corporate is really relying on an external email solution provider to monitor your inboxes of your organization, to get the bad links before they get into your inbox. And if those bad links do get into your inbox, be able to overwrite those links. Should threat intelligence come in saying that they're later bad, you can actually prevent a click on one of those things, and that's going to mitigate that overall. So you're working multiple different angles, right? There's no one provider that fits all of those pieces, but it's definitely what the banks are doing. Specifically, TD Bank is they're partnering with the right providers to be able to offer all of these things to their customers to get them to what is the new commercially reasonable standard.
There's a lot of good things that both of you said. And when you talked about the emails, we have a service and it blocks tons of stuff. If you ever look and see how much it catches, it's ridiculous to see the amount of traffic that's nonsense. But every once in a while, something gets by, and then you get this alert and saying, hey, this one got by. We've isolated. It tells you what the threat level was because somebody somewhere in some other organization clicked on something. And so that's part of the power of the network, whether it's email filtering for business email compromise or networks like you're talking about on your end, Chris. Let's shift from the reasons for the shift to responsibility, support, and response. Now, I'll begin with you, Chris. What do companies need to do in light of this increased threat, the concern about being good stewards of our data, of our payments? What are some of the actions that we need to be taking?
We'll start with two categories to keep it sort of brief. One, communication category, actions, put multi-factor authentication on everything. And by everything, I mean your email and your personal email, your phone, that includes your internet phone that you log into online, because many of us are working from home. You could just log in with a username and password and you're on that phone. You have to actually toggle multi-factor for most of those so that they'll go to your cell phone. Also put it on your cell phone. One of the most prevalent damaging BEC fraud attacks over the last few years that we have seen attempted are the full takeovers of cell phones by having new SIM cards issued. And they can pass all of your codes to send payments out or update your banking information. So that's like a number one of securing your communication, both your voice communication and your email communication. I couldn't tell you the number of people I have in my personal life that come around. I got hacked, my emails. And I'm like, well, what was in your email? That was my password list and everything else in my life. I'm like, oh my goodness, just toggle that multi-factor on. That's going to be critical. When it comes to payments, for checks, positive pay. I mean, that's just like waking up and brushing your teeth in payments today. But when you think of ACH transactions specifically, you have to do the validation upfront. As we move to more real-time settlement engines as well, if you're not pre-validating, the faster the money leaves, the faster the money is taken out of that fraudulent account, the faster it settles, right? So you have to do authentication up front and pay attention to when you hear the word validation from any provider. Validation could be that the account is just open and eligible for payment. And that's how a lot of people use it. It doesn't actually mean that it's in the name of that business. So ask critical questions of anyone you partner with to make sure that they're really getting into the nitty gritty of what they're doing and how they're selling you something and how they're providing a solution to you to make sure that you're getting exactly what you need.
So, John, from a banker perspective, how do you see that banks can help their clients develop a better defensive posture? What are the levels of security or the ability to scale that you talk about? Chris talked about a couple of services that hit on the bank side, as well as some outside traditional banking like multi-factor authentication.
It does kind of blend together, like I said earlier, Craig. So Chris did a great job in identifying a lot of the different areas that businesses can kind of help themselves. So from a structural layer perspective, I couldn't agree more with what Chris said about positive pay, ACH positive checks, blocked filters. But I think there is an element too of making sure that companies are engaging with their banking partner to ensure that that structural layer is where it needs to be, running a kind of strategic look across all of the different bank accounts and in what way they're using those accounts, and then making sure that they're leveraging, whatever technology may be available that the bank may have. Like we have, provide our clients access to the PayModex network, and there are other areas that help businesses, reconcile on a daily basis. That is something that clients should be doing. That's just kind of like Chris said, from an accounting perspective, waking up and brushing your teeth. But also I would say, to take it a little bit further, to treat your business network with the respect it deserves, right? So making sure that any access onto the network is through a trusted, Wi-Fi network or a trusted secure network, and, not working at Starbucks or something, anything like that. And then from a human perspective, and this is something that, like I said before, banks can help educate clients about the risks that are out there. But also, in partnering with Strategic Treasurer, there's a whole list of different courses that are curated to financial professionals, right? Because what financial professionals are facing today is kind of like a heightened level of attack than somebody might be facing personally.
That's excellent. Thanks for the shout out too. So as we move towards the end of today's discussion, anything else on responsibility support or how companies should react or move forward? Or are we ready to go into final thoughts?
I'll add one more. Make sure you engage with your banking partner early. Make sure they know about your business. Make sure you know what to do if there's a fraud. How do I recall funds? How do I call? How do I get immediate action? What buttons do I press? And check in with them, at least quarterly. What's new? What's coming? One of the things that we definitely see is a continued focus on security. Just keep asking those questions, demand more. I think it's important. I think that banks are delivering on a higher commercialization standard, and the corporates have the opportunity to be ahead of that and get in early. Something you saw, even if you think about the United Kingdom, they rolled out confirmation of payee, which helps account validation, but a lot of the banks in the UK didn't actually sign up for it. And a lot of corporates didn't know it was available. And I think it's great with this piece of education that we're doing today and the ongoing education that's going to really lead to dividends and a lot less fraud.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And John.
Chris kind of opened the door for me here, but having a business response plan, a business continuity plan, and a plan to practice that is incredibly important. And Chris touched on it a little bit, but when a situation happens, when you're faced, and like I said before, it's not if or when, how do you respond? Having that plan in place can allow you to respond in a way that is, as I say in the military, I had to bring it up, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. When you have a plan in place, you can execute in a methodical way that will allow you to not make the mistakes that you would if you were just reacting and it was chaotic. So having that plan is incredibly important. And then also a business continuity plan where you may be backing up data so that you can still operate your business. It buys you that amount of time where, if you're hit with a ransomware situation, you can notify your bank, notify the FBI, make sure people are aware, and potentially resolve that without paying the ransom because you're able to operate your business without, on a separate piece or a separate service, separate data. So I think that that's incredibly important. So, and then lastly, yes, practice, right? So if you have these plans in place, make sure that you're practicing them.
Well, excellent. Thanks, John. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate the insight in today's discussion. I'm looking forward to the rest of this series on security. Thank you both.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.